one of the fundamental griefs that we're really talking about is simply the grief over change. And Kathy, you're speaking about Jean just finding herself not being the person that you've always been, is a huge thing in itself. And this is one of the, long before our lives are radically changed by souls moving in and out of their bodies, we are constantly under the experience of everything in this world being so unstable that no matter how much we get something set, then something else happens. And the fundamental cause of our discomfort is that we define ourselves by the circumstances around us, by the people who are in our lives, by the talents we have within us, by the things that we own, by the way that the world perceives us. We have all of these different, based on what's going on around us, ideas about even our, just all the way to the core. You know, who would I be without my husband, wife, child, mother, father? Who would I be without my articulate voice? Who would I be without my ability to play the piano? You know, without my beautiful body, whatever it might be. But one way or another, something that is in itself temporary and external to our essence has insinuated itself so deeply into our life experience that they've become synonymous. So when any one of those is threatened or destroyed, we are convinced, and it's a real experience, it's not just a dream experience. We are convinced that now my fundamental happiness is impacted by this. And it is. We can talk philosophy all we want, but it really is impacted. We are a pattern of energy. And that pattern of energy is all the different experiences that we've had. You know, when they hypnotize people, they discover that in their memory bank somewhere, they find all the experiences of their life, even from childhood, things that you wouldn't even think you were conscious enough to know at the time, but you find that it's all stored within you. It's just been suppressed or put into the background by more recent experiences. They find when they do a certain kind of past life regression that people seemingly, I believe it's at least theoretically possible, I don't know if it's always true, but it's seemingly possible that you can go back and access the experiences from lifetimes in other bodies, in other time zones, in other cultures, in other countries. And you can find out that those experiences are right there for you. People can relive them with all the exhilaration and all the grief. And oftentimes such regressions are undertaken because people are having inexplicable experiences, usually experiences of sadness or fear or physical debility or illness of one kind or another that no one can access. And oftentimes it leads people to maybe the cause is in some previous incarnation. And they'll go back, they'll take you back, people who can do this. I say this with a slight condition because not everybody who claims to do it can do it, but it can be done. And all of a sudden you're able to bring into present awareness that which is still a part of you. Now think about it like this. If our consciousness is continuous and not actually terminated by the death of the body, if there is a soul existence that was present before conception and that actually enters in to the mother's womb, literally makes the body and then lives out its own destiny. And if at the time that this body is done, that soul essence just goes on. I think of it very much, we just had Halloween, and some people are very skillful in their costumes, and they can put on a costume so complete that you really have no idea who you're talking to. No matter how complete the costume you put on, if you go way back inside, the animating spirit is still recognizably the same. If we think of many incarnations as putting on costumes that are so complete that at first we may not know who we're talking to, but then the qualities begin to come out and we recognize that person. I mean, think how many encounters you've had, many of which turned into lifelong alliances, where there was some immediate recognition is the only possible word. Even though you may never have seen this person before, there's just something that this is not a stranger to me. Where's my sweater? Where did I put it? There it is. When I met Swami Kriyananda, recognition would be a certain word for it, but I didn't think of it as personally recognizing him. But I had an absolute immediate sense of the relationship that I had with him, which is that he had what I wanted and that I needed to be where he was. I didn't name it farther than that, but it came to me, and I mean literally, in about 15 seconds from when he walked into the room. I mean, where does something like that come from, except that this is a continuous story? And you just started, and then you were separated, just as if, I spoke to you, Karen, and said, when did I see you before? Because I could remember you, but I couldn't remember from where. So you meet Judy, who used to be Henry, who before that was Christopher, and before that was Juliet. And so you look at her and you say, I know you, but when did I know you before? Swami Kriyananda said that he would always recognize people through their eyes. And in fact, I discovered something about him, which is that whereas other people see people's eyes, they're blue, they're green, they're brown, he has large eyes, round eyes, almond eyes. Swamiji never knew what the physical eyes looked like, even of people he knew for a long time. And he said it was because he never looks at people's eyes, he looks through them, into them. And so the eyes for him are literally the window of the soul, and the physical eye is not even part of his perception. And he says when he hasn't seen someone for a long time, and I realized when he meant that was not just a few months or a year or two, he meant an incarnation or a few. He said sometimes he doesn't recognize them at first, but when he looks into their eyes, gradually they come into focus, was the phrase he used. And I've actually seen him, just sort of be a little puzzled, and then it will click. And there'll either be something from the previous life that he knows, or he'll just remember who you are. But just from looking into your eyes, he'll remember. I would be trying to recognize the face. He was looking at the spirit. So if we can even imagine, and I think for the purposes of this discussion we shall assume it, that we all have had this continuous reality. I believe it was the Dalai Lama who was asked this question, or some Buddhist monk was asked to talk about reincarnation. And his answer was perfect. He said, you think of all of your different lives as individual separate events. He said, I see them as one continuous flow. So if we look at our incarnation now and think, I used to live here, I used to be a child, I was married to that person, then I was single, then I married, you referred to marrying Ben, and with a sense of gratitude, and I know it wasn't your first marriage, and so that gratitude came from what happened before. But what happened before, you didn't see it as, you weren't just plucked out and everything was forgotten and you started anew. It was a continuous flow I had those experiences, then I had these experiences, now I'm having these experiences. And they could be radically different one from another. But the way you described that, when you started with Ben, everything that happened before oriented you in a certain way in relation to that. In this particular case, it was a very positive orientation. But you wouldn't have had that positive orientation if you didn't have a continuous influence that turned you that way. Now, when we get into the idea of reincarnation, where we become confused is that we do not have a conscious memory of the experiences that we had before. There was a little boy, we had an ashram house in San Francisco for about 10 years. It was a mansion up on Broadway there. And we had about 40 people lived in this big house. And one of the a family lived there, a couple, and their little boy was about 4. And he was at the stage where his body would move, but he wasn't always in control of his body. And one of the consequences was almost every dinner, the glass of milk got knocked over. And one of the dinners, when he knocked the glass of milk over, the father just got so impatient. I can't remember the child's name. Son, you've done it again. And the little boy just looked up at his dad like this and said, "Daddy, when I was the daddy and you were the little boy, I didn't get mad at you when you knocked over the milk." And he was young enough because this life hadn't, from children until the age of 6 or 8 often have very vivid past life memories. In fact, Yogananda says, if you want to know your own past lives or the past lives of your children, look at what they're interested in and how they're inclined until the age of 6 or 8, because a lot of those talents are still there. I have a very odd memory. I've never done any, I do sew, but I've never painted or done any work with clay or anything in this life. It's not I've never done it. But I remember being 4, and my girlfriend, her name was Joan, but for reasons unknown, we called her Wivels. Wivels, my girlfriend Wivels, and I, we did some sculpture out of mud, how little kids will. And I remember my piece, and my piece was like a snowman. It was 3 balls that I had piled on top of each other, made out of mud. And I was so determined that my mother would put that in the oven and that we would fire that. I can even remember visualizing it bronzed. I didn't quite know how you made something bronze, but and I was completely committed to that art, absolutely. I mean, here I can still remember it so strongly. In this life, I've had no relationship to that kind of work, but somewhere in my life I have. Lifetimes I know that I have, and it was in that moment, it was so strong that I remember how frustrated I was that nobody could finish it for me. And I knew it was possible and important that it be done, but nobody would do it. Can you imagine from the mother's point of view? It's a little 4-year-old girl carrying these mud balls around, trying to get her to bake them for her. It's like, what? I mean, my mother was very sweet to me, so I wasn't traumatized, but it just couldn't be done. I remember putting them in and out of the oven, but nothing that I wanted to have happen happened. But where does a thought like that come from? I took ballet. Dance I have more of an affinity for, even though I never followed it. But my picture of myself as a ballerina was, it was magnificent. And someone said, just one of these people who talks about past lives, says often when young children are like my sculptor or like me and my tutu, they are actually living another incarnation. And that's why their conviction of how good they are and how seriously they need to be taken is not merely just childhood whim. It's they know, they've spent a lifetime becoming good at this. And even though the body's not responding, everything about that is still there. I'm so am interested. The internet gives us access to so much now. And also, I think times are changing, and people are being born with the power to hold their consciousness more. And so we see these remarkable examples of young singers or young dancers. There's some are piano players. There's some like 8 or 9-year-old girl, who has an operatic voice that's just stunningly beautiful, and is really the fully developed voice of a diva. I can't remember exactly what her name. She taught herself from records, and she has a memory of having hundreds of people at her feet because of her voice. I can just imagine that woman, whoever she was. She's probably a famous singer whose name we would actually recognize. I can just see her at the end of her life thinking, I've spent this whole incarnation building this up. I am not giving it up. And just something in her just held on to it. I mean, prodigies are like that. But for a child to have a full woman's voice, it's more than just talent. It's like she just refused to become a child in that respect. Because there's physical realities, what to speak of emotional ones. But she just wasn't gonna let it be interrupted. Okay. Now, what we have to do in order to deal with everything that we're talking about, the answer to all the discussions we have is all about how we define ourselves. Who do I actually think I am? Now, bear in mind, you can have a very elevated definition of yourself, and it can still come all the way down, all the way down to the smallest detail of the life that you're living now. If you have a small life and you're identified in a small way, it doesn't necessarily rise up. Rising up is a choice that you have to make. But from the highest, the most expanded perspective, everything small can also be perceived. I say this because it's important to understand that God also gives us these beautiful and deeply meaningful, intimate relationships in this body at this time. And we mustn't think that we have to either choose between my devotion to my loved ones and my devotion to God. Because the greater always includes let's put it this way, the eternal also includes the temporary. And you have to also understand that the temporary gains its power from the eternal. So it's not as if there's anything wrong with the temporary. It's just simply temporary. Nowadays, people put so much into their weddings and just spend months planning these events and these sort of huge experiences that people have. And when they're done in the right spirit and the right way, they can be just absolutely, absolutely glorious. I remember a woman at Ananda Village. She came from a very well-to-do family, and she was one of 2 daughters, and she also had 5 brothers. I'm going to just put a little aside here. I had dinner with this woman once. She might have had 7 brothers, if I'm not mistaken, but she was one of 2 girls in the family. I have never seen anyone eat as quickly as that woman ate. And when she had completely finished her dinner, when I had barely picked up my fork, I was rude enough to say, "Oh my, look at that." She said, 7 brothers. There was the fast and there was the hungry. She said Another man, this is just a by the way, he was a priest from Ghana, actually. And I was at a retreat with his Episcopal priest, and I was at a retreat, and he was there, and we were saying grace over the food, and he was one of 13. Wow. And he said, "In my family, you never closed your eyes during grace." Yeah, everybody kept their eyes on the dishes the whole time. But anyway, this woman, when she got married, her parents just gave her a blank check. And Ananda, having hundreds of members, she just had the greatest time in the world putting on this huge party. I'm not much for that sort of thing. I wasn't. But at first I was a little like, why are we doing this? But then I realized, it was, and she just made this beautiful event. Put up a tent and a music place and beautiful decorations, and everybody was in the wedding, the clothes they needed. I mean, she just had a marvelous time. And it didn't last but a few hours, but it was absolutely worth it. It was temporary from the start. We all knew it. It was a dream. And then we just lived it out and played it out together. Was it less beautiful because it didn't last? You see, that's the simple question. Does something have to last forever? Is its beauty determined by the fact that it never changes? And then we have to ask the other question. Everything is going to change. Are we going to set ourselves against the absolute inevitable? And many people do. Many people just set themselves in opposition to that which they have absolutely no control over and is going to run over them. And then, well, here's the surprise. They suffer. I'm amused by Kathy saying, if it would help, I would do it. I remember at a certain point in my life when I had lost something that was very dear to me, and I was grieving, and then it occurred to me that what I had lost was irretrievably lost. That the entire cosmos, it wasn't death, but it was simple change. The entire cosmos had gone on. And what I was grieving over was there was no power in heaven or earth that was ever going to return to me what I wanted. And I saw that if I grieved for this, I would have to grieve forever, because there was no alternative. And when I just thought about that in my heart, do I want to grieve forever? And I'm not a person who thrives on suffering. I'm a bad sufferer, which in some ways is good, because I'm compelled to find solutions, because I can't thrive under sadness. Every single individual has a karmic pattern that they're playing out. And they have a way of learning their lessons and finding their destiny that is unique. And even though our paths can cross, you can even grow that child's body in your own womb, as Swami put it, and I think this is the most beautiful way to say it, he said, the male and the female, the mother and the father, create the physical vehicle for a soul to follow its destiny. But the mother and father do not create either the soul or its destiny. They create only the vehicle for it to follow it. This came through for me over a period of many years, and really came to a focus when I was taking my parents through to the end of their lives, in a situation that sounds not dissimilar to what you went through, and Bethany's in the middle of it right now. First, I'm a person of a great deal of energy. I have a lot of willpower. I have good motives. I like to help people. And I can often make things happen in other people's lives. I remember once when somebody was unwell, and I made them a quart of carrot juice every single day. I'm not sure they even wanted a quart of carrot juice every single day, but I decided I was going to make them carrot juice every single day. It stands out in my mind because it was an example of that. And yeah, it took time and commitment and all of this, but I was just going to do it for them. So every single day I'm delivering that quart of carrot juice just to make them well, because I wanted them to be well in whatever way it was. And just, I'm sure you're all of similar temperaments and you know how you get involved and you help people. Sometimes your help is helpful and sometimes you're just doing what? Okay. So that was an ongoing syndrome. And sometimes I would feel a little not quite centered, and I could feel that there was something not quite on target about what appeared to be my generous willingness to help people. Then my parents became ill, and my mother had Parkinsons for 15 years, and Parkinson's is a hell of a disease. And over a long period of time, it's really quite something to watch someone disintegrate. They lived in Southern California. My sister took care of them for a long time because she lived close to them, and then she herself, she was a tweener. She was raising a child and helping her parents, and then her own health became compromised. And so I ended up having to take a lot more responsibility than I had anticipated. I thought it would be her and not me. So now let me get all the pieces here. So as my mother's condition began to deteriorate, my mother, and this is to her credit, and I'll add this to it later, the disease for my mother was a great blessing. And even she herself, after about 12 years, she said it to me like this: I hate to admit it, but this has been the making of me. Because she was a little spoiled and a little willful and a little, I want it my way. And don't give me any guff about it. And suddenly she had to develop willpower and discipline and determination. And, she died a much better person because of 15 years of fighting against that. And she fought for every inch. But it was annoying, very annoying, because instead of letting me take over and organize everything, so that it would all work better according to my idea of how it should work, she had this, insistence that she was going to do it her way, which was not nearly as convenient for me and did not nearly fit my picture of how she was supposed to conduct her life. And so I was running around doing the equivalent of making a quart of carrot juice every day for people who didn't like carrot juice, right? Because I could help them. And I wanted to help them. Somewhere in all of that, this sense of there's something wrong with this picture began to build. And finally it cracked open for me in a way that was very similar to what you just said. I'm not afraid of my own karma. It's not that I sit around and pray for god-awful, challenging things to happen to me. I don't have that kind of courage. I've never prayed that all my karmic debts be paid in this lifetime, like Kamala Silva prayed. I would never pray that. I'm way too chicken, just way, way too chicken to pray that. But I believe that whatever God sends me is for a purpose. It is because of my own karma, and therefore is going to exactly match what I need to learn. I believe that God is in charge and will give me whatever I need to take me through it. It occurred to me that I didn't trust anyone else. I believed that I could handle my karma, but nobody else could handle their karma without my intercession. And wow, talk about an insult. And I really began to understand that the slight resistance to my willingness to take over your life and make it better was not really that they didn't like carrot juice. They didn't like being treated like an invalid. They didn't like the undercurrent in my behavior, which was, well, you obviously can't handle your own life, so I'm going to come in here and handle it for you. And it was subtle, but it was definitely there. That my so-called concern for other people was not really concern for them. It was this deep-seated fear that they were incompetent. I just didn't respect them to learn their own lessons, to have their own destiny. It had to look like my life, or they couldn't have it. And I realized what I was doing with my parents was I was acting as if it was my destiny. And if this were my destiny, this is what I would do. So you must do it. And it occurred to me one day, I mean, my mother pushed back, believe me. It occurred to me one day, first my mother said this, every time I cough, you think I'm about to die. I'm not about to die. There's a lot of life left in me, she said. And I sort of, where did that come from? But she was right. She was exactly right. I was always sure that she couldn't deal with it. That's how she read it, but it was even partly true. Oh, this is the big decline. Now I have to rush in and do X, Y, and Z. But I realized also that where my parents were standing, they were in, it started earlier, but they got into their 80s. They had gotten there inch by inch by inch by inch. Every decision they made was completely consistent with all the karma up until that point, and it was the inevitable next step. And far from being this huge aberration that had to be repaired, they were standing exactly where they needed to be standing. And my inability to respect them enough to recognize that was about as far from helpful as it could possibly be. I was just pulling all their own integrity out from under them. And why? Because I was afraid. It was all my fear. There was no love. There was no generosity. It's going to be inconvenient for me. It's going to be unhappy for me. You're going to make a mistake. I'm going to suffer because you're going to suffer. But who am I talking about? I wasn't relating to them at all. I was only relating to me. It was big. And then, so what I started doing was I started looking at my parents and started thinking, what would you like to have happen? What is right for you? You want to stay in your home. You want to have caregivers. You want to do things that might end up in disasters. You might create big messes. You might get hurt. You might even die. But who am I to interfere and take your life away from you? And as soon as I started actually seeing it from their point of view, and they were going to die, and they might have disasters, but that was the destiny they had to follow. And I switched my prayer. And this is the prayer that I use to this day. I don't pray for outcome. I pray, Divine Mother, whatever it is you're trying to teach them, help them to learn it. And sometimes that prayer has been very intense. Help them to learn it and learn it soon, because whatever it is I'm supposed to be learning, I'm not doing so well here. So if you don't help them soon, I'm going down too. It's all very honest, but it's where it should be standing. And if they need to go through this, you're going to have to, take care of me at the same time. And all my intensity can be channeled in that way, because the infinite includes the infinitesimal. My heart is breaking. It's extremely difficult for me to see people I love suffering as I perceive it. But do I really not want them to grow and learn? Do I really disrespect them so completely that I can't imagine that they're not having the karma that they need and they're incapable of drawing a lesson from it? Really? Is that really who I want to be? Is that really who I think they are? When a person is very ill, like my mother was ill, but what she had was a gradually declining ailment, not acute like your mother's has come on. They have to listen carefully to what's being asked of them at this point. How much do I struggle? When do I surrender? What karma is my karma at this point? And if you, my goodness, maybe we could shut the windows there. We're just talking about all ends of the spectrum here. If you are able to not be afraid of the alternatives. Imagine, think of this, and Karen, let's go to you, because you have this fear of your children suffering when you die. Okay, let's do it with you, because it's imaginary.
Well, you just helped me.
Okay, but also, so here you are, and you're dying. And you're dying. You have some ailment that's not going to be recovered. You're dying. But you're so concerned about your children, so your children probably want to talk to mom about the fact that she's dying. But mom is so afraid of the pain they're going to suffer that she can't talk to her children about dying. So she talks to the mailman. Really, literally. Or she talks to, the maid. There's so many stories of how the people who are closest never have any open conversation. And all of the conversation happens with total strangers, because total strangers are going to let you have the conversation. Here's a story from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who was the pioneer of hospice. And part of her philosophy was that a family member is dying, you put the hospital bed in the living room, and everybody's part of the story. So this girl who was about 9 or 10 had terminal cancer, and she wasn't going to recover. So they put her in hospice, and she was in the middle of the living room, and she just kept outliving everybody's expectations. And she had a little brother whose whole life was now dictated by the fact that his sister's dying in the living room. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was conscious enough to know there's something off, because the natural progression of this is being held up. So she came to counsel. She talks to the little brother first, and the little brother is 6 or 7. He's honest enough to say, she's going to die. Why doesn't she just get on with it? He said, I can't bring my friends over. I have to talk in a whisper all the time. Come on, sis. She just needs to do it. And so Elizabeth says to the little brother, let's go talk to your sister. So the little brother sits next to the hospital bed and says, come on, sis, you're going to die. Why don't you just die? And she says, every night, this little girl says, every night I pray to die. And every night, Mommy prays that I live one more day. She said, if you and I prayed together, maybe we can out-pray Mommy. That's just exactly what she said. So Elizabeth gets the mother and the father in the room and asks the children to talk to their parents. And the children talk to their parents. And within a couple of days, the girl dies. Yeah, whose destiny are we serving here? And how are we, if we're afraid, we can't say anything out loud. And just there we are. A friend of mine who's helped several people through cancer and is helping another through to death in cancer. She's talking now about the fact that she's helped 2 people through who would never talk to her about the fact they were dying. She had to help them literally to their last breath without ever being able to say, well, you're dying, because everybody was affirming or whatever. And she was talking about the one she's helping now. It's just so wonderful, because we're just having conversations about the fact, that it's over. But if you think that people can't handle it, if you're so afraid of their suffering, who are we respecting? So things are what they are. And the more we resist change, the more we grieve. If you think of it as a great big chapter book, and this is the part in which we pull the plug and everybody is present. And this is the part in which I'm a baby in my own son's family, And this is the part in which I pull the plug on who is now my daddy, and then this is the part in which we're all back in the astral world. If we think of it as one continuous event in which we always have the opportunity to learn something that we need to learn. As I said, I've never given birth to even one child, what to speak of more than one, but everybody who has tells me that from conception, you're dealing with a specific individual. And when that individual is born, you know that this one is not that one. This woman that I knew, she was in the most difficult position. She had twins. And one of them was a dear friend, and one of them was an ancient enemy. And from the beginning, she adored one and had an aversion to the other. I mean, of course, it was hard on the averted, the twin that wasn't loved in the same way. But we are drawn together. Master said sometimes enemies are drawn into the same family, and I'll use the phrase he used, so they can fight it out in close quarters. Because unlearned lessons bring us together. And to have an aversion to someone is also to be focused on them and to have given them a disproportionate importance in the great scheme of things. And that's what we're all working out. Disproportionate importance because of positive attachment, disproportionate importance because of negative aversion. The deeply held belief that my self-definition and my happiness are dependent on whatever that list might be. There was a story told, and I can't remember exactly where. It's in some book about death and dying and the astral world, which is one of the things we were going to talk about. And it was a story about a woman who had died in a concentration camp. And some of you may have heard this because it's a well-known story. She died with this absolutely unrelenting hatred for the Nazi who had tormented her. And she was in hell with him in a hellish part of the astral world because she could not let go of him. So she followed him into the next world because hatred is giving a disproportionate value to someone else and their power to determine who you are and what your happiness is. And she had to learn, if not to forgive, if not even, ideally to forgive, but at least to let go of the experience. Now, I've had some insights into suffering. I had this conversation with a woman, and she really helped me to understand something. And this is the bringing it down to the infinitesimal. Swamiji has often said, Master has often said, that omnipresence also implies that omnipresence means that you are also present in the smallest aspect of things. And if we're going to think in terms of the human life, your affection for your lilac bush, for your kitten, for the sun when it comes in the window, for the mother who raised you, for the children that you gave birth to. If you stand back and look at the whole thing from the billions of lifetimes that a soul has, this one may not look like very much, and we might try to intellectualize it in that way, but that's a mistake, because every little spark of beauty and love it has within it all of infinity. And we don't please God by rejecting that. When I was very new on the path, there were two people in my life, two women, one of whom was my dearest friend, and the other was just this horrible enemy of mine. And the three of us were together almost all the time. Circumstances brought us this way. One of them I loved, and one of them I disliked very much. Eventually we got over it and everything resolved, so I can speak of it somewhat lightheartedly now, but it was not funny when it was happening. And I remember saying to Swamiji once, this is my only excuse is I was very new on the path, because he knew what was always going on. Every so often he had to arbitrate when the cat fight got really intense. And I said, the problem is not that I dislike this one, but that I love this one too much. So I need to equalize things by loving this one less. Swami was rarely sarcastic, but he looked at me and he said, that is the stupidest idea I have ever heard. He said, the ability to love greatly is given to us so that we will understand that that's how we can and should love everyone. So to deny that in the name of somehow trying to be more spiritual is to take what God is really trying to show us as possible and just miss the point entirely. There are other ways to do it. That's a mistake of what even-minded means. Even-minded thinks that you're supposed to make everything dull. That's not true at all. You're supposed to make everything infinite. And so these intense, positive, even attachments, these wonderful relationships that are given to us, it's given to us so that we'll understand what our own potential is. And it's perfectly natural to enjoy it completely and lament when it's over. You have a great experience. It's just been wonderful. There's a part of you that just loves to relive it and think how fortunate I was to have that. But if this is where I was going to say about grief and suffering. Merely to lose something or have something end, and to have a wistful sense of how beautiful that was is just the natural way of the human heart. And Yogananda himself took it very deeply when the people he loved left this world. Autobiography of a Yogi talks about how he felt when his mother died. He even says, and it's interesting, it was years before I was reconciled with Divine Mother. It's a very interesting statement. It's right there in his book. Swami writes in Stories of Mukunda about when Yogananda's little fish died. And Yogananda wrote a little poem about his fish dying and how sad that made him. In autobiography, he talks about his attachment to the fawn and how when the fawn was overfed and the deer was going to die, that Yogananda prayed for that fawn to be able to live. And the soul of the deer had to come to him and say, it's my time to go. You've got to release me. I mean, it was so interesting to me that that story is included in that book because so many people love their animals and have such a close association. And here Yogananda's talking about loving this deer so much that he didn't want to let it die. And he had to be reminded to allow to have that deer go forward, which of course he did. And then he let the deer go, but he had to be reminded. And when Sister Gyanamata died, who was his most advanced woman disciple, he wept at her funeral. He saw her merge into the infinite. He knew that she was completely free, but he wept at her funeral. I mean, oftentimes in life, we just see something that's so beautiful, it brings tears to our eyes. Isn't that so? It's just the poignancy of it is so intense. It makes us weep. And that's just the way we're made. We wouldn't want to not have a tender heart. So that experience is not the delusion. The delusion comes what we do afterwards. And this is where I see the stumbling block comes with people, which is either we feel that we are the victims of fate, that somebody is doing something to us, instead of realizing that God is just taking me through where I need to go. And that everybody here is learning something they need to learn. Even though the lessons are tough and painful, there's no sense that I'm the victim of somebody's wrong action. Or the other is that we become afraid of suffering. And then we have this complex, which is based on the fear that it might come again. Now, otherwise, we just suffer. And we suffer, and we grieve, and we weep, and we lament the nature of life, in which beautiful things change and are not there anymore. And then, gradually on a deeper level, we accept and we go forward. And we have suffered, but we're not suffering now. If we take that as something so much to be feared, that life now is all about making sure that nothing happens again, then we have not only suffered, but now we have a complex about suffering, which molds everything. Or if we are unable to understand that everything happens as it was meant to happen, as it had to happen for the good of all concerned, that nobody is a victim here. But if you're a victim, then you're here, and all of your energy is, why did they do that to me? Why didn't they understand? Why didn't I, And maybe it's your own thinking, why didn't I get this other treatment? Why wasn't I there in time? And it's just all, and so it never stops. And the problem was not that your heart is tender and when beautiful things fade away, you feel it. The problem is that you're always in rebellion against the way life is. So give yourself the full permission to be tender-hearted. But at the same time, don't make a complex out of the consequences of that. And also don't, for example, harden your heart over the fear of it might happen again. So you're watching your father decline. You watched your mother go. So these things happen. How could we imagine that they wouldn't? And who knows? Cancer is a very... I was looking for this quote recently because I can't exactly verify it, but I seem to remember reading that Master said that cancer is an extremely good way to work out karma. That it's just the nature of it. It's probably because it's so internalized. I don't know what the answer would be. I haven't been able to find the quote, so I don't want to assert it until I can verify it. But I believe that's what he said, that it's a very good way to work out karma. That a person has a tremendous opportunity when you're struck with cancer. Among other things, usually you have a little bit of time. Sometimes you have a lot of time. Sometimes you just have a little bit of time, but you have some time. And you see what's happening and you can sort through and release all of the different things that have to be sorted through and released. I know when a woman in our community came, her cancer she'd had earlier metastasized, and when it metastasized, there was no possibility. She lived longer than anybody thought she would, but the woman and her husband, we went over to see Swami Kand, who was in Italy when the diagnosis came, because she didn't know if she'd be able to travel later, and she didn't know if she'd live long enough for him to return. But Swami, just sitting there, just said to the husband and to the wife, just very calmly, he said, one or the other of you could have just gone off in the morning and been killed in an auto accident, and you would have had no time. He said, now you have time. You have time to resolve. You have time to let go. And she had time to develop a lot of courage, just like my mother had to admit. It's been the making of me. Develop a lot of courage in the face of what you might not have wanted to face. And why would we not want that to happen? Once we're gone, and it's all finished. It's just all away. When that woman, actually when the doctors finally said, we really can't do anything more for you. Just by intuition, I went to visit her unannounced on the very day when her doctor had just told her that. God was putting me there. And she was so dear. And she said, I know it sounds silly, she said, but I thought I was going to get better. And even though she'd never had a chance of recovering, she just said that I thought I was going to get better, just like a little child. I thought Santa was going to come and bring me everything I wanted. And then she kind of made a gesture to her home and to the pictures of her family and everything. And she said, how can I leave all this? What could I say? She was going to have to leave all this. And I said, there's a wall of fire and tears. I said, you're going to have to walk through. Because why be dishonest? The attachment to all of that was not going to let go easily. I said, there's a wall of fire and tears, but you will walk through it and you will discover freedom on the other side before you die. And just in the last days of her life, she just said to me, you were right. And yes, it was a wall of fire and tears. There was no denying it. See, that's where the fear of suffering has to also be overcome. Because we're very tender-hearted. You build a life in a certain way. You have certain expectations. Those expectations are destroyed. It's not something that you can just casually toss away, and you shouldn't even try. You just have to put it in context with everything else. And the most powerful one is simply, whatever it is you're trying to teach me, Lord, we better get on with it because I don't seem to be learning it. And then after that, you just have to live through it. But you learn things that you could never learn in any other way. And then at the end of that, you think, well, why would I have wanted this different? It's very confusing. That's all I can say. Swami would often say, whether you're suffering or whether you're happy, it's really all the same. I can't say that I understand that. I'm closer to understanding it than I used to be. But I still have a strong preference. Swami said very strongly, nothing happens when you die. And we think something happens. From this side, it appears that a great deal happens because we are so accustomed to defining the person through the body that we're seeing. Just like at Halloween, we see the costume. But for each of us individually, we live inside this body, but if you think about it, you have such a big inner reality going on all the time. We remember our childhood, we remember all the stages of our life, we remember all the people that we've been with, even all the past life influences. So we live through this body, but this body is not who we are. So when we lose this body, for the person watching the body go away, there's this strong feeling that the person has left. But for the person who takes off the body, they have this sudden realization, oh, I've just taken off my body. And that I am just the same as I've always been. We have all these movies nowadays, which are really doing a great job of showing us what that's like, isn't it? Where the body is down and then the same actor gets up and starts walking around and starts being exactly themselves. I mean, not every movie is philosophically sound, but all of them have a piece of that. And Swamiji was so wanting me to understand in that moment, nothing happens. Your mother just walked out of that aging body, finds herself still herself. You see, this is where from our perspective, we look at it as individual events, but from the perspective of the person with the expanded vision, being freed suddenly from the preoccupation with this one, they just find themselves moving. They find themselves exactly as they have always been, with the consciousness a little bit more expanded because not confined by flesh, but still just essentially the same person. I said you have the same vibration. Except, so if you're a good person, you're all your goodness and your faults and your weaknesses are all still there, just exactly the same. And you essentially have a certain vibration of consciousness, and you are drawn into the astral, the material worlds. This material world is heterogeneous in its vibrations, which is very good people and very bad people share this space. You could be sitting over at Starbucks. You could have a saint having coffee on this side. You could have a really evil person having coffee on that side. And you can all just kind of be hanging out together. It does stratify to a certain extent. People are drawn to the groups that fit them, but still we can cross each other. The astral world is pure vibration. And so in the astral world, the vibrational stratas are distinct from one another. So people of goodness and refinement go to places of goodness and refinement. And even if you have faults and weaknesses, still your essential nature in a very mathematically fair way is all that's counted. Not your anxieties about yourself and your excessive regrets and your tiny self-criticisms. It's just your essential vibration. You have an essential note. And you are drawn into an astral world which matches that. So for most good people, you go essentially to heaven on some level. And there you meet all the different people that you have known, which is not just the people in this life who have died, but people from, we've had many associations with many. We just get a very arbitrary group here. And we recognize a lot of those people and we're with them. And we have guardian angels and wiser beings who help us. How precisely that world mimics this one, Swamiji says that this world is a faint shadow of that one. And Master writes in Autobiography of a Yogi, there's beautiful scenery, there's wonderful sunsets, there's light, there's music, there's color. Everything that we think of as beautiful here is highly intensified there. And you see the astral world that's your astral world. If you are kind of a dark brown, gray person, you go into a grayer world. In fact, if you don't have the capacity to perceive more subtle than material worlds, Master said you don't really wake up in the astral world because you don't know how to perceive without a physical body. So people who have meditated or prayed or have enjoyed refined things, like refined music and refined beauty and generous love, it's an expansive energy. And so you go into a world where those kinds of things are even greater and more possible. And you recover. You recover from whatever difficulties or tiring experiences you have. You reflect, you learn. Some people speak of it, as Swami said, almost like it's psychological counseling. He didn't really think that that was valid because it's not so intellectual as that. How and what you do, I'm not sure. You're busy. Swami said we all have Ananda community. We had communities in the astral world. We were together in the astral world. And you work on yourself, just like here, where we help each other. We try to grow. We try to understand. We try to develop our capacity to self-express. Swamiji says the astral world is the same world. We don't change. When Paula, my friend Paula, was dying, she talked to Swamiji on the phone, and she said, she had a very childlike way, Swami, I hope they have a job for me up there. I like to be busy. He said, Paula, I'm sure they'll use you. Don't worry about it. And after she died, I was very conscious that Paula was helping me a lot. And I asked Swami about that. He said, Swamiji, I feel like Paula's just helping me. And I said, is she conscious of me? He said, oh, yes. That her awareness was expanded enough that she would be able to keep track of this world and all the people that she loved. She would be influencing us, not visibly, but she would be projecting positive thoughts, just like we project positive thoughts. It's the same world. Now, when my mother died, I had a very odd question, which is I had been very dutiful to my mother, and it was important to me to take care of her properly because they'd been very good parents to me. I had no reason not to. But I didn't have that close a personal tie with her. It wasn't so. I respected her and she loved me. I loved her, but we weren't sisters of the spirit like I am with some people. So once she wasn't my mother anymore, it wasn't, in my case, as if I felt the need to stay connected to her. At the same time, I didn't want to hurt her feelings. So I asked Swamiji, if I just move on, will she know? And he said, no, he said, for her, he said, she'll have a vague memory of this world, but the details won't be clear to her. For Paula, he gave me a different answer because Paula had a much more expanded awareness. My mother's reality was this world. But she's just moving on now and doing whatever she needs to do in order to get ready for her next incarnation. People stay in the astral world as long as they have astral karma, which is as long as it's beneficial for them to be on that plane, they'll stay on that plane. Some people want to come right back to the material world quickly, even advanced souls, because they just want to get on with it. Sometimes they'll stay a long time in the astral world and do astral work, whatever that looks like. Because in the astral world, you can send your energy and even come and visit vibrations that are lower than yours. In other words, you can help the people who need to learn what you have already learned. Same here, isn't it? You can help the people that you know something they don't know. You can't go too far down, but you can help the people that you're drawn to help. But you can't help someone who's more advanced than you because they know something you don't know. So in the astral world, each higher realm is projecting and serving those who need their help and are bringing them up. And people have different temperaments. And the same temperament, just like Paula. I like to be busy. So I'm sure they had a job right for her, and she went right to work. And part of her work was to continue to be the friend of some of us to whom she had long been a friend. And even if you reincarnate in another physical body, your superconscious self can be present. People often ask that question. If I see my grandmother, does that mean she has to wait for me to come? No, she might actually even be a child somewhere at the same time. But just like when your body goes to sleep, sometimes your consciousness can go places that your body is not going. So your grandmother may be a 3-year-old child somewhere, but her consciousness can go to the astral world and help you. She won't necessarily remember it in her child's body, but she'll come in some way that you can recognize it. Now, everything in the physical world, they say, is a replica of the astral world, just on a grosser level. Now, I'll tell you these 3 dreams that I had of my mother, which were extremely interesting. She was sick for a very long time, and that the deteriorating body, was a very intense reality for her. So, and my mother she didn't trust a lot of people. She tended to be a bit critical and always really, she called me once and I dropped everything and flew to Los Angeles thinking there was some incredible crisis going on, and she wanted me to make an appointment with the dentist. And I canceled all my classes and jumped on a plane and rushed down there, and the urgent need was that I call the dentist to make an appointment. I had to do a lot of double breathing, but to her it was important, and she didn't trust anybody. So soon after she died, I had this dream of my mother, and Parkinson's causes you to hunch a little bit. So she was fairly shriveled, and she was sitting on the edge of the bed, looking very similar to the way she did when I saw her, which was I saw her on Sunday night, and she died on Tuesday morning. She was sitting on the edge of this bed, but I could tell that she was in a hospital. And I have read that, sometimes when people die and have been sick for a long time, they don't understand that they're not sick anymore, because that thought form is so strong in their consciousness. They may even know that they're dead, but they don't know that they're old. They're not old. So she was there, and she was still so identified with this. And in the dream, she'd called me. And I'm there with her, and I can see that there's others to help her, but she's not relating to any of them. She calls me over, she has me sit next to her, and she tells me that she needs certain things done. And was so absolutely true to life. She needs certain things done. I said, Mom, I think there's a lot of people here who could help you. She kind of looks around like this, and she says, I don't think so. I need you to do this. But I looked at it and I thought, no, I don't think so. I think she needs to open up to the people who are around her. So I said, Mom, I think I'm just going to let them do it for you. And then in the dream, I just kind of backed away from her. And then I woke up. So the next dream I had of her, my father was still living, and my parents were together for 56 years, and my mother was deeply attached to my dad. They were both attached to each other, but she was really attached to my dad. And the next dream I had, I was visiting my father in the care facility where he was living, and my mother suddenly shows up. And now she looks young and well. She doesn't look old anymore. And she hasn't really come to see me. She's come to see my dad. And so they went off into their bedroom. Suddenly we were in their home, and they shut the door. And I was just delighted that she'd come, and I was delighted to see that she'd accepted that she'd gone on. But after a very short period of time, she starts calling my name in a very plaintive voice. And I open the door, and I see that she is disintegrating back into being an old woman. And the youth is leaving her, and she's shriveling up like this. And I grabbed her, and I pulled her like this, and I pushed her out of the room. I said, Mom, it's too soon. It's too soon for you to be here. You haven't understood yet. And I just pushed her out, and I closed the door so that she would go away. She was still attached. She wasn't able, just like we grieve on this side, it's not automatic, because nothing happens when you die. And this is where people, in extreme cases, become ghosts. But just as you have to get over the change in attachment, they have to get over the change in attachment. So I pushed her out of the room and shut the door. Then, now this dream, it must have come after my father died. It's hard for me to imagine that I had this dream before my father died. I'll tell you this other little piece. My dad lived 2 years. When he died, he basically went to bed and refused to get up and wouldn't eat or drink. And, the people called us and we said, leave him there, it's time. And so my sister and my brother and I were both there, and we sat with him for a few days, and then he breathed his last. It was a beautiful passing. And the next day, my brother and sister and I are all over sensitives, I guess you might call us. We have a intuitive thing. And we talked to each other, and we said to each other something none of the three of us had ever said to each other, which is during those whole 2 years, whenever we would think of our mother, it was always a little bit unsettling. And we couldn't think of her. And it wasn't grief. It was just unsettling to think of her. And so we didn't think of her very much. After my father died, when we thought of my mother, it was perfectly clean. I think she just couldn't accept that he wasn't with her. And as soon as he died and was with her, she finally let it go. So I had this third dream, and as I say, I'm a little unclear now whether it came afterwards or before. But I'm in a room, I'm standing at a window looking out, beautiful bright sun, my mother's standing right next to me. My favorite picture of my parents was their engagement picture. They were 24. My mother looks exactly like she looked when she was 24, just radiantly happy. And I realized, it's done. You made it. Congratulations, Mom. And I've never dreamed ever since. Just completely ended at that point. So what happens is they get to keep learning and they get to keep living. And they get to work it out too. There's another side of it, which is important on this side. Daniel Brinkley, who's done a lot of hospice work and so on, he said the question he gets the most, because Daniel would often talk about how free and beautiful the astral world is. He said, doesn't my mother miss me like I miss her? Now, my dream experience tells me that they, their attachment is the same as our attachment, and they have to work their way through it. It's a little easier for them because being out of their bodies, the relationships that are so defined by that body, like mother, sister, child, which when you stop and think about it, is all about your physical body. So when you dissolve your physical body and are in the astral world and suddenly realize how many mothers, sisters, fathers, sons, friends you've had, poodles, Great Danes, Labradors, chickens, fish, all of those things, suddenly the one that you experienced here is not less dear to you, but you really see it as a flow. So it's a little easier from the astral side to realize that much less has been lost than you think has been lost. But certainly from the experience of my mother, I think that you're also holding on. But what Daniel said is, from the astral side, your vision of time is so different. That from here we have this sense of this, I'll have to live the rest of my life without my mother. Whereas from the astral world side, they realize, she'll be here in a moment. And so if somebody's just gone out to the store for the afternoon, you're not so concerned about it. Interestingly, just as a sidelight, my father's understanding of things in the last few years was not great. And when I went to see him the first time after my mother had died, because I was out of the country when she died, the caregivers told me that they were not telling him that she had died because he had such short-term memory loss, that when he asked about her, they just said she's out shopping. Now, I didn't like this very much. I thought this was disrespectful and dishonest. I should have listened to them. So when he asked me about Mom, I said, Daddy, she died. And he said, she died? Because he had short-term memory loss. And every time he was told that she died, it was the first time he heard it. And so it was cruel to keep telling him that. So I didn't want to lie to him. So I said, oh, she's away for a while. You'll see her soon. I couldn't bring myself to say she was out shopping. But I saw the perfect wisdom of it, which is, there's no progress in grief if you have short-term memory loss. So who knows how the whole cycle plays itself out. But if we accept that suffering is a necessary teacher, and that it's all right to be tender-hearted and to have loved the gifts that were given to you, and at the same time not resent that those gifts are not going to last forever, we're just sad because it's over, and perfectly fine simultaneously because it's over, because everybody's going where they need to go. And we don't serve, in fact, we do a great disservice to those who have died to mourn them excessively. In Italy, when we were taking Swami down the road to where his house was at one point, there was a little shrine by the side of the road, and there was fresh flowers in it. And Swami looked at it and asked about it, and one of the residents said, 2 years ago, a young man was killed on a motorcycle at that point, and every day his mother puts fresh flowers at the spot. And Swami says, what a burden to that poor man. I mean, wow, from this side you think, oh, what wonderful devotion to the memory of her son. He said, what a burden to him. He said, he will be forced to repudiate her completely in order to be able to go on, because he can't be in the astral world and have this person constantly, just reminding him of what's happened before. And think what a problem that creates for him. I was thinking of it once like, if you raise your child and then your child decides to go study in Europe and goes off to Paris and is having a wonderful experience, and every single day you write and you say, oh, I miss you so good. I'm just so miserable without you. I put fresh flowers in your room every day and put cookies and milk there for you. I mean, what is your poor daughter going to do? She's going to not answer the phone when you call. But why would you not want her to expand her realities and go on? Why would you want her to stay a little child in her bedroom for the rest of her life? And what we have to understand about death is that we keep our bodies exactly as long as they serve our consciousness. And as soon as being in that body does not serve the expansion of your consciousness, you will take it off. You will not take it off a minute before, but you will not keep it a minute longer. And to try to make someone hold their body because I want you to hold their body when it's not serving their consciousness anymore, really, is that love? And you have to ask yourself, who am I loving? In the book that I published, Ask Asha, I think it's the last one, is about this woman whose Great Dane had to be put to sleep. And it had to be put to sleep after she'd given it to someone else, and then they had put the dog to sleep. And she was just completely overcome with guilt and couldn't get over it. But among the things I wrote to her was, being a Great Dane is probably a lot of fun, but really, how expansive is it? You go for a walk, you pee against a fire post, a tree, you play with your toy, you go to sleep, you have your kibble or whatever it is. I mean, really, what are the options? You can't play the piano, it's just like, you don't even get to raise your babies. Like, what is it? Would you really want to keep someone you love in that body indefinitely? Can't you imagine a point at which done? Been there, done that. So, exactly the same. Once a person is in a terminal cycle, it doesn't really matter what decisions you make. The soul is in charge and nobody is in charge but their soul. And you think each of these, I put them in the wrong home, we had the wrong operation, we gave them the wrong treatment. I actually don't think any of those things are actually your decisions. If you have two brothers who don't believe it, you just have to say to God pretty constantly, hey, let's not make this really ugly, okay? Let's just make it like it needs to be. Danyon Brinkley actually says something. This is a medical fact. The whole crisis of medical expense, this is a fact. Like 70 cents of every medical dollar is spent in the last 6 months of a person's life to extend their life an average of 21 days. And then Danyan adds, those 21 days will be the worst 21 days you spend in your body. Just completely pointless. And he calls it life greed, is what he calls it. The soul is in charge of its destiny. And even if you think somebody's doing something to somebody, I really don't believe that that's happening. This has just been my intuitive observation. One should do the best you can do. And also, the soul is not really in the body in the same way. We're watching it, but the soul is also watching it. Once the body is as compromised as they are at that point, the soul is not stupid. It's not going to hang out as intimately. And it's just sorting out the last bits of karma here and letting everybody sort out the last bits of karma. And you have a relationship with your parents, but so do your brothers. And your parents have things with your brothers, and your brothers have things with your parents. And if you don't get your way, that doesn't mean that it isn't happening, because your parents love all their children. And they've got to let them all, oh, look, that one is going to get to play out his last little bit of, everybody's going to play it out. And you just have to say, whatever everybody's trying to learn here, help us all to learn it. Whatever it might be, just help us all to learn it. I've had to say that to a lot of people. The soul's in charge, even when you start in this cycle. When you have a serious cancer, for example, should we do this? Should we do that? Should we do this? Do that? Just do whatever seems sensible and don't worry about it. Because the soul is doing what it needs to have done, and it really doesn't matter as much as we think it does. I'll tell you an interesting death story. This was a man who died of cancer, and friends of ours, Durga and Vidura from Ananda village. It was Vidura's one of his best friends who didn't live at Ananda. But he died, and he tried many different treatments and ended up in a clinic in Mexico with a treatment that didn't work either. But when he was actually literally on his deathbed, his wife invited Vidura down there because she knew that he knew about death and she didn't. And that they were close enough that he could help. So they were with him for the last week. And he was really in the last hours of his life. And his wife was sitting on one side and Vidura was sitting on the other. And he kept looking. He would look at Vidura and then he would look at his wife. He just sort of, because his wife was keeping him here in this world and Vidura was going to help him into the other world. And he kept going like that. And then he said his eyes actually split and he looked both ways at the same time. And then his wife said, "This is for you to do, not me." And she literally got into bed next to him, laid down next to him and went to sleep. She was, just exhausted. And she just curled up next to him and went to sleep. He was able then to turn his attention completely to Vidura and he took him through. When we were called in to help a woman die, this is a woman who put her 4-year-old child in our school. And I worked as the admissions director at that point, and I took the child in. And this is the mother who wept in my arms because she was afraid putting her child in our school would hurt her child's chances of getting into Harvard. No, I laughed. I laughed about it a lot, except I couldn't because she was crying on my shoulder. But she somehow knew that she needed to put her daughter here. Now, the way the story unfolded was really very touching and heartrending. A couple of years into that child's career here, the mother got brain cancer. And the family was very lightly involved with Ananda, but not deeply. And our entire association was through the school. They would come to occasional events. So now we have a 6 or 7-year-old child whose mother's dying of brain cancer. And the husband turned to us for help. And when the woman collapsed and was taken to the hospital after maybe 2 years. He just called us. And there was about 4 or 5 of us who really hardly knew the people, but he knew that we could help her. So they took her off life support, took off the breathing tube, but she went on for 12 more hours. And we're all circled around the bed. And he's very sweetly telling us stories about their life. And she's unconscious in front of us, and he's telling us all about their lives, and he's reliving. And they had a little daughter, of course, all this whole thing. Finally, it's about 4 a.m, and he just suddenly looks up and he says, "She'll never die while I'm still here." And he just said, "I'm leaving. I leave her to you." And he went home. So it was about 5 of us in the room, and we were with her for a little while, and then, more hours passed. Finally, we were just really hungry. We'd been there a really long time. So we all trooped out for breakfast. We went downstairs to the place. We had just gotten our breakfast in front of us, and this kind of wave went over all of us. We've got to get back upstairs. And we just rushed back upstairs. And while we were gone, she had transitioned. When people begin to die in that way, what I've seen is that for a long time, they struggle to breathe in. And you hear this sort of energy, and then they'll let the breath out. And then at a certain point, they struggle to breathe out. And they'll take a little inhalation, and all of that effort will be on the exhalation. And I've heard that shift a number of times, and it always signals that they're really just about to go. When I heard my father do that, my sister she was at her house. I called her, I said, "Get over here right now." She came, and within half an hour he went. We come upstairs and she'd shifted. She just needed a little empty space, and then she shifted, and then we helped her pass through. And then, because the final is an exhalation, so now they're trying to get out. And then there'll be a long pause, and then they'll take another breath in, and then they'll try to get out. But it's just, it has its own rhythm. The point was what? Just to say that. We all play our own parts. And so many people have told me, "I was with my mother continuously, and I walked out for 5 minutes and she died alone," they'll say. And they'll be very upset about that. No, she couldn't leave while you were there. She just couldn't. She had to find that moment when you were gone. Swami's recording of the Om is a wonderful thing to have in the room when someone is dying. When my father was dying, my father knows nothing about these things, but we just played that continuously, 24 hours, constantly in the background. The Om sound is what people hear when they begin to leave. And Swami's voice has such power in it. I mean, everybody who came in and heard that would immediately say, "What is that?" They didn't know anything about it, but it set this, so that whatever was going on in the room, you were always listening to that. Many people have found the sound of music is helpful. I find Swami's music particularly helpful because it moves you into the astral world. And that Om is so neutral. Nobody has any idea what it is, but it still works. The primary thing we are is not afraid, so that the person who is dying isn't afraid. We're also not very noisy and not very busy, and we're not very worried about every little thing, and we're not trying to, "Do you want some water now? Would you like this? Is this what you want? Can I do that for you?" Just being very calm and very relaxed, relatively quiet, and keeping this thought here. But when she actually began to die, we didn't have the tape then, because I hadn't thought of it at that point. But we were chanting Om. We were moving her energy up like this. We were speaking to her quietly about whatever light you see go into that light. Sometimes people put their hand, here to just really help move from the medulla to the spiritual eye. All of those things are very, very helpful. Or you can read prayers if you know what your people like. I remember in Stephen Levine's book, this man said, "My Jewish grandmother is dying, and I'm going to sit by her bed and read her the Tibetan Book of the Dead." He said, "Why don't you sit by her bed and sing Yiddish love songs?" She's much more likely to respond to that. So you can, but I would make it upward. But make it upward in a way that they can reach. I found the Om tape to be universal, but just in a way that they can reach. And sometimes life review doesn't hurt. I think that that man sitting across and rejoicing in all the wonderful times they'd had together was very sweet. It's all right to be sad too. We just can be all these things simultaneously. We can exist on so many different levels at the same time. That's why I say suffering is fine. It's when we try to make the universe conform to our wishes that we get into trouble. Just being sad is okay. Everybody understands that there's a beauty in sadness, especially when it's in celebration of something that was beautiful. Yeah. My, I wish it were different. Somehow it's the planet that it's the way God made it for reasons of his own. When my father died, his last breath, I felt such a rising joy. I just was so happy. And he was very well liked where he was. And a lot of the people in the staff came in and some of them were weeping. I thought to myself, my gosh, you live here, people die all the time. Do you cry every time someone dies? But they would try to comfort us, and I was just laughing, and I was so light. And my sister, who was more sensitive than I, punched me in the ribs. She said, you've got to behave more appropriately. I said, I can't help myself. She says, well, then go stand over there. But I felt he was just so free and happy. I didn't feel that necessarily with others, but with him I really felt it. I just felt this shooting energy. Om Guru. So I think that's the end of our story. Thank you very much.